During the summer of 1999, in a quiet town in the mountains of Tennessee, a newly married woman vanished without warning, and authorities were left with nothing. But more than 17 years later, a single discovery changed everything, and it exposed a dark secret no one was prepared for. The Great Smoky Mountains of eastern Tennessee offer some of the most breathtaking, deeply secluded landscapes in the American South. The region is defined by rolling, tree-covered peaks, thick morning fog, and a profound sense of isolation. In August of 1999, 27-year-old Ryan Bennett and his new wife, 25-year-old Claire, drove their packed sedan up a winding, steep mountain road. They were heading toward a beautiful, isolated timber lodge surrounded by thousands of acres of dense forest. For the young couple, this peaceful honeymoon was supposed to be the absolute perfect beginning to the rest of their lives. Ryan was a highly patient, deeply kind high school history teacher who approached the world with a calm and steady demeanor. Claire was a vibrant, creative woman who worked as a florist in their hometown. She had a beautiful smile, a tiny, distinct birthmark resting just below her left ear, and a habit of gently twisting her silver wedding ring around her finger whenever she felt slightly nervous or overwhelmed. But beneath Claire's bright personality was a heavy history she had desperately fought to overcome. Her early 20s had been defined by a highly toxic, deeply turbulent relationship with an ex-boyfriend who was incredibly controlling and emotionally manipulative. The relationship had left her with deep psychological scars and a paralyzing fear of conflict. When Claire finally met Ryan, he offered her exactly what she had been searching for her entire life. He gave her absolute safety, unconditional respect, and a quiet, beautiful love that demanded nothing in return. Their wedding day, held just 4 days before the trip to the mountains, was a massive triumph for Claire. As she walked down the aisle, her friends and family wept, completely believing that she had finally left her troubled past entirely behind her. When Ryan and Claire arrived at the mountain lodge, they spent their first day completely immersed in the joy of their new marriage. They hiked along the quiet, shaded trails, took photographs near a rushing waterfall, and ate dinner on the wooden balcony of their cabin, watching the sun slowly set behind the towering pine trees. The atmosphere was incredibly romantic and entirely safe. There was absolutely no sign of danger, no strange vehicles following them, and no indication that a massive, terrifying nightmare was quietly waiting for them in the dark. On their second evening at the lodge, exactly at 8 o'clock, the sun completely dipped below the horizon, plunging the heavily wooded property into deep, heavy shadows. Ryan and Claire had just finished eating dinner in the main dining room and were walking back toward their private room. Claire suddenly remembered that she had promised to call her mother that evening to tell her how beautiful the mountains were. However, cellular phone reception in the rural, mountainous areas of Tennessee in 1999 was notoriously terrible. The thick timber walls of the lodge completely blocked the weak signal. The front desk clerk had previously mentioned that the only place to get a consistent, clear connection was outside, standing near the very edge of the gravel parking area. Claire stopped in the main lobby, holding her small leather purse. She told Ryan she was going to step outside for just a few minutes to make the phone call. Ryan smiled, kissed her softly on the forehead, and told her he would go back to the room and wait for her. He walked down the carpeted hallway, completely expecting his wife to return in less than 10 minutes. When Ryan entered their room, he left the door unlocked and turned on the television. 10 minutes slowly passed, then 15 minutes. Ryan assumed that Claire and her mother were simply caught up in a long, happy conversation. But when 25 minutes had gone by, a strange, deeply unsettling feeling began to gnaw at the back of his mind. The mountain air was incredibly cold that evening, and Claire had only been wearing a thin jacket. Ryan turned off the television, put on his shoes, and walked out of the room. He retraced his steps through the quiet lobby and pushed the heavy glass doors open, stepping out into the freezing, pitch-black night. The gravel parking area was completely silent. The only sound was the loud, rhythmic chirping of thousands of cicadas hiding in the dense forest. "Claire," Ryan called out, his voice echoing loudly into the dark trees. There was absolutely no answer. Ryan walked quickly across the gravel lot, scanning the dim spaces between the parked cars. He assumed she might have walked further down the driveway to find a stronger signal. But as he approached a small, wooden bench sitting directly under a flickering yellow street lamp at the edge of the lot, his heart completely stopped beating. Resting perfectly neatly on the wooden slats of the bench was Claire's small leather purse. Sitting right next to the purse was her folded jacket, and resting directly on top of the jacket was her cellular phone. But Claire was entirely, completely gone. A massive, suffocating wave of pure adrenaline crashed over Ryan. He sprinted around the parking lot, aggressively screaming her name into the dark woods. He ran behind the lodge, completely ignoring the freezing mud soaking through his shoes, frantically searching the shadows. He ran back into the lobby, his face pale and his breathing frantic, demanding the front desk clerk immediately call the police. Within 30 minutes, the quiet mountain road was flooded with the flashing red and blue lights of the local county sheriff's department. The massive, immediate emergency response shattered the peaceful silence of the Honeymoon resort. Heavily armed deputies fanned out across the property, sweeping the dark tree line with bright tactical flashlights. The lead investigator assigned to the chaotic scene was Detective Kendrick Hayes. Hayes was a sharp, deeply methodical veteran of the force who had handled missing persons cases in the mountains before. When he arrived at the lodge, the sheer emotional devastation of the scene was overwhelming. Ryan was sitting on the wooden bench, shaking violently, entirely unable to comprehend how his wife could simply vanish into thin air. Detective Hayes immediately secured the area around the wooden bench with yellow crime scene tape. He put on a pair of latex gloves and carefully examined Claire's abandoned belongings. The physical evidence created a massive, terrifying psychological contradiction. The phone, the purse, and the jacket were placed exactly where Claire had left them. There were absolutely no signs of a violent physical struggle. The gravel around the bench was completely undisturbed. There was no broken glass, no blood, and no heavy, chaotic footprints indicating someone had been dragged away against their will. Furthermore, there were no aggressive tire tracks tearing out of the parking lot. The scene completely defied logic. A newly married woman who was incredibly happy and deeply in love does not willingly take off her jacket, leave her phone and purse behind, and silently walk away into a freezing, pitch-black forest in the middle of the night. Someone had taken her. But the predator had operated with a terrifying, phantom-like precision, slipping into the parking lot, taking a grown woman, and vanishing without making a single, detectable sound. Hayes immediately mobilized a massive search effort. He ordered search and rescue dogs to be brought up the mountain. He deployed dozens of volunteers to walk shoulder to shoulder through the dense pine forests surrounding the lodge. The handlers allowed the heavy bloodhounds to smell Claire's jacket, hoping they would immediately pick up her scent and track her into the woods. But the dogs walked in confused circles around the wooden bench, whining softly, entirely unable to pick up a trail leading away from the parking lot. The scent simply ended at the bench. Detective Hayes knew exactly what that meant. Claire had not walked into the woods. She had gotten into a vehicle, but there were absolutely no witnesses. The parking lot was empty, and the other guests in the lodge had been entirely asleep or eating dinner. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Desperate for any solid lead, Detective Hayes demanded to speak with the general manager of the lodge. He asked if the property was equipped with any external security cameras. The manager nodded, looking deeply shaken. He explained that they had a closed-circuit television system that monitored the front lobby doors and the main gravel parking area. The cameras recorded directly onto bulky VHS tapes in a small security office behind the front desk. Hayes and Ryan followed the manager into the cramped, windowless office. The manager ejected the current tape, inserted it into the playback machine, and began rapidly rewinding the grainy, black and white footage to 8 o'clock. Ryan stood behind the desk, his hands gripping the back of a chair so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He held his breath as the grainy image of the parking lot appeared on the small glowing monitor. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read 8:05. The heavy glass doors of the lobby opened. Claire walked out into the cool night air. She was wearing her jacket, holding her purse in one hand and her cellular phone in the other. She walked slowly across the gravel lot, stopping directly in front of the wooden bench under the street lamp. The camera angle perfectly captured her placing her purse on the bench and taking off her jacket. She held the phone up to her ear, looking completely relaxed and entirely safe. Ryan felt a heavy, agonizing lump form in his throat. He was watching the absolute final moments of his wife's normal life. Claire stood by the bench for nearly 2 minutes, trying to get a signal on her phone. But as Detective Hayes leaned closely toward the monitor, waiting to see exactly who approached her from the shadows, something impossible happened. At exactly 8:08, the grainy video feed on the monitor suddenly, violently cut out. The screen instantly turned into a chaotic mess of bright white static. Ryan gasped, demanding to know what had happened. The manager frantically hit the buttons on the machine, completely confused. He explained that the camera system had never failed like this before. They watched the harsh static fill the screen. The heavy, agonizing seconds ticked by, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a full minute. Then, exactly 90 seconds after the video feed had cut out, the monitor flickered violently, and the black and white image of the parking lot suddenly returned. But the image on the screen had completely, devastatingly changed. The wooden bench was still entirely visible under the street lamp. Claire's jacket, purse, and phone were resting perfectly neatly on the slats. But Claire was completely, entirely gone. The parking lot was entirely empty. There was no vehicle driving away. There was no shadow running into the woods. The entire abduction had happened completely inside the missing 90 seconds of static. Detective Hayes stared at the glowing monitor, a massive, sickening chill running directly down his spine. Security cameras do not simply shut off and turn back on by pure coincidence at the exact moment a woman vanishes into thin air. The terrifying, undeniable reality of the blackout became instantly clear. The missing 90 seconds was not a mechanical glitch. The blackout had been deliberately, flawlessly planned by someone who knew exactly how the lodge operated, and they had been waiting in the dark for the perfect moment to strike. The terrifying, impossible reality of the 90-second blackout completely shifted the entire nature of the investigation. Detective Kendrick Hayes stood in the cramped, windowless security office of the Mountain Lodge, staring blankly at the glowing monitor. Security cameras do not simply turn off and turn back on by pure coincidence at the exact moment a woman vanishes into thin air. The next morning, as the bright mountain sun completely failed to burn away the heavy, suffocating dread surrounding the lodge, Hayes brought in a specialized forensic electrician to examine the property's electrical grid. The technician traced the heavy wiring from the lobby cameras directly to a massive, gray metal breaker box bolted to the exterior wall behind the kitchen. The technician put on latex gloves and carefully pulled the heavy metal door of the box open. He pointed his flashlight at the thick plastic switches inside and looked back at Detective Hayes. The technician explained that the breaker system had absolutely no mechanical flaws. There had been no power surge, and there was no internal short circuit. But upon closer inspection, the forensic team found faint, fresh scratch marks on the metal latch of the box. Someone had been standing in the freezing darkness behind the kitchen, entirely hidden from view. They had manually pulled the heavy switch downward, completely cutting the power to the parking lot cameras and the overhead street lamps. They had stood in the pitch-black darkness, counted exactly to 90, and then violently slammed the switch back upward, restoring the power. The blackout was no accident. It was a highly organized, deeply terrifying, calculated strike. The predator knew exactly where the breaker box was located, and they had patiently waited in the shadows for Claire to step outside completely alone. Following standard police procedure in any missing spouse investigation, Detective Hayes immediately turned his focus toward the husband. Ryan Bennett was brought into the local sheriff's department for an official interview. Ryan sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, his clothes heavily wrinkled and his eyes completely bloodshot from crying. He was entirely cooperative. He handed over his cellular phone, surrendered his vehicle for a full forensic search, and immediately agreed to take a polygraph test. Ryan passed the polygraph with flawless precision. His entire demeanor was not one of defensive deflection, but of absolute, raw devastation. He was a man whose entire world had just been violently ripped away. When Hayes asked Ryan if anyone had a reason to hurt his wife, Ryan's hands began to shake violently. He looked up at the detective, his voice cracking with a heavy, desperate intensity. He told Hayes that they needed to look at Claire's past. He gave the police a single name that would completely consume the entire investigation: Dylan Cross. Detective Hayes immediately pulled the background files on Dylan Cross, and the psychological profile that emerged was absolutely terrifying. Dylan was Claire's ex-boyfriend, and he was the exact definition of a deeply toxic, highly controlling manipulator. Hayes interviewed Claire's mother and her closest friends, and they all painted the exact same horrifying picture. Claire and Dylan had dated for nearly 3 years, and the relationship had been a complete nightmare. Dylan dictated where she went, who she spoke to, and how she spent her money. When Claire finally gathered the courage to leave him, Dylan completely refused to accept the breakup. He had stalked her relentlessly for months. He repeatedly called her workplace, parked across the street from her apartment in the middle of the night, and left dozens of desperate, angry voicemails. But the most damning piece of evidence came from an incident that had occurred just 2 weeks before the wedding. Claire's best friend tearfully explained that Dylan had cornered Claire in a grocery store parking lot. He had aggressively blocked her car door, screaming at her, violently demanding that she cancel the wedding. He had sworn that if he could not have her, absolutely no one else ever would. Detective Hayes felt a massive, electric surge of adrenaline. The motive was perfect. The history of stalking and obsession perfectly fit the profile of a man who would follow his ex-girlfriend on her honeymoon, locate the security breaker box, and take her in the dark. Hayes immediately assembled a team of heavily armed deputies and drove aggressively toward Dylan Cross's last known address, a small, dirty apartment complex located nearly 2 hours away. They found Dylan sitting on the front steps of his apartment, smoking a cigarette. He was a tall, heavily built man with dark, cold eyes. When the police cruisers violently surrounded him, he didn't run. He didn't look surprised. He simply dropped his cigarette, crushed it under his heavy work boot, and casually held his hands out to be handcuffed. Hayes dragged Dylan into the exact same windowless interrogation room where Ryan had sat just hours earlier. Hayes threw the photographs of Claire's abandoned purse and jacket onto the heavy metal table. He leaned directly into Dylan's face, his voice roaring with a fierce, unyielding anger. He accused Dylan of tracking the newlyweds to the mountain lodge, cutting the power, and forcing Claire into a vehicle in the dark. Dylan leaned back in his metal chair. He looked at the photographs of the missing woman he had obsessively stalked for over a year, but his reaction completely chilled Detective Hayes to the bone. Dylan was absolutely, terrifyingly calm. He didn't ask if Claire was hurt. He didn't deny stalking her in the past. A cold, arrogant smirk slowly spread across his face. Dylan simply looked at the veteran detective and told him to check his work schedule. Hayes walked out of the room, completely furious, and ordered his deputies to verify Dylan's location on the night of the disappearance. The response from the records clerk hit the entire investigative team like a massive, suffocating physical blow. Dylan Cross possessed an absolute, unbreakable, rock-solid alibi. On the exact night Claire vanished, Dylan had been working a mandatory 12-hour overnight shift at a massive commercial construction site located in Nashville, Tennessee, nearly 400 miles away from the mountain lodge. Hayes desperately tried to punch a hole in the timeline. He thought Dylan might have clocked in and quietly slipped away, but the alibi was completely flawless. The police contacted the construction foreman, who provided the official, stamped physical time cards. Furthermore, the authorities interviewed over 30 different construction workers who had been pouring a massive concrete foundation that entire night. Every single one of them placed Dylan Cross directly at the worksite. They swore he had been operating heavy machinery alongside them for the entire 12 hours. The site also had its own security cameras, which showed Dylan wearing his bright yellow hard hat, mixing concrete at exactly 8:08 in the evening, the precise moment the camera feed cut out at the mountain lodge. It was geographically and physically impossible for Dylan Cross to have been at the Honeymoon resort. He was legally untouchable. The police had absolutely no choice but to officially eliminate him as a suspect. Dylan walked out of the sheriff's department with a deeply arrogant smile on his face, leaving the entire investigation completely paralyzed. The brutal, agonizing reality of a dead end slowly settled heavily over the small mountain town. The police had completely lost their prime suspect. The massive search of the dense surrounding forests yielded absolutely nothing. The lakes were dragged, the hiking trails were combed by volunteers, and the county highways were searched for any signs of a struggle. But there was absolutely no physical evidence. There were no strange tire tracks, no fibers, and no blood. Claire Bennett had simply vanished into the pitch-black mountain air, leaving her entire life behind on a small wooden bench. Months slowly passed. The warm summer transitioned into a bitter, freezing autumn. The bright yellow missing person flyers taped to the storefronts began to fade and tear in the heavy mountain wind. The massive crowds of volunteers eventually had to return to their jobs and their own families. The case officially began to grow cold. But Ryan Bennett completely refused to leave the mountain. He rented a small, cheap apartment in the town below the lodge. He spent every single day walking through the freezing woods, holding a heavy walking stick, desperately searching for any sign of his wife. He handed out thousands of flyers, completely unable to accept that she was just gone. It didn't make sense. It just didn't. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. 6 agonizing months after Claire completely disappeared, the heavy silence of the cold case was suddenly, violently shattered by a highly unexpected phone call. A young man working as a cashier at a small, rural gas station, located about 10 miles down the winding road from the mountain lodge, had been watching a local news broadcast. The station ran a short, deeply tragic update marking the 6-month anniversary of the Honeymoon disappearance, flashing a large, clear picture of Claire onto the screen. The gas station employee recognized the tiny, distinct birthmark resting just below her left ear. He immediately grabbed the phone and called the sheriff's tip line. Detective Hayes drove aggressively down the mountain to interview the young man. The clerk was standing behind the counter, looking incredibly nervous. He explained that he remembered seeing Claire on the exact afternoon she vanished, just a few hours before the 90-second blackout. The clerk explained that Ryan had driven their sedan up to the gas pumps. Ryan had walked inside the store to pay for the fuel and buy a few bottles of water, leaving Claire entirely alone by the passenger side of the vehicle. While Ryan was inside the store, the clerk was wiping down the front windows. He watched as a man suddenly approached Claire from the edge of the parking lot. The clerk described the interaction as highly intense. He told Detective Hayes that the man had completely invaded Claire's personal space. They had engaged in a fierce, deeply heated argument. The clerk swore that Claire looked absolutely terrified, frantically shaking her head and taking several steps backward until her back hit the side of the car. The argument only lasted for about 30 seconds before the strange man quickly turned around and walked away, disappearing behind the gas station just moments before Ryan walked out the front doors with the water. Detective Hayes felt a massive surge of hope. This was a completely new lead. He immediately pulled a large, thick manila envelope from his briefcase. He spread 6 different photographs across the glass counter of the gas station, creating a standard police photo array. Right in the center of the photographs was a clear, high-resolution picture of Dylan Cross. Hayes asked the clerk to look carefully at the pictures and point to the man who had been aggressively arguing with Claire. The young clerk leaned over the counter. He stared at the 6 faces for nearly a minute. He looked at the photograph of Dylan Cross, tapped the glass counter with his finger, and completely shook his head. "That's not him," the clerk said, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable certainty. "I am completely sure. The guy who was yelling at her was much older, completely bald, and had a heavy scar on his chin. I've never seen any of these guys in my life." Detective Hayes completely froze. A massive, terrifying chill washed completely over him. If Dylan Cross was pouring concrete 400 miles away, and the man arguing with Claire at the gas station was a complete, unidentified stranger, the investigation had just been violently thrown into a completely new, infinitely more terrifying direction. Who was the bald man with the heavy scar? Why was he aggressively cornering a newly married woman on her honeymoon? And most importantly, did he follow them up the winding mountain road, locate the heavy electrical breaker box behind the lodge, and quietly wait for the sun to go down? The completely new physical description of an older, bald man with a heavy facial scar completely paralyzed Detective Kendrick Hayes. He stood inside the rural gas station, staring at the young clerk, realizing the entire trajectory of the investigation had just been violently derailed. Dylan Cross was pouring concrete 400 miles away, surrounded by dozens of witnesses. The man aggressively arguing with the newlywed bride was a complete, unidentified stranger. Hayes immediately requested a state police sketch artist. The artist sat down with the gas station clerk, spending hours meticulously drawing the harsh, weathered features of the bald man. As soon as the sketch was finished, Hayes grabbed the drawing, jumped into his cruiser, and drove aggressively back up the winding mountain road directly to the Honeymoon Lodge. Hayes ordered every single hotel employee into the main dining room. He held the charcoal sketch high in the air, demanding to know if anyone had seen the heavily scarred man on the property the night Claire vanished. For a long, tense minute, the room was entirely silent. But sitting in the back row, a young, 19-year-old housekeeping maid named Sarah began to tremble violently. She looked at the sketch, covered her mouth with her hands, and burst into heavy, frantic tears. Hayes immediately pulled Sarah into the empty security office. The young girl was hyperventilating, completely terrified. Through her heavy sobs, she confessed a devastating secret that she had been hiding from the police for over 6 months. Sarah admitted that she had absolutely seen the bald man with the scar. At exactly 8 o'clock on the night of the disappearance, while Ryan was waiting in the hotel room, the strange man had walked directly into the main lobby. Sarah was sweeping the hardwood floors just a few feet away. She watched the man deliberately approach Claire. He didn't speak a single word. He aggressively bumped into Claire's shoulder and secretly slipped a small, folded piece of paper directly into her hand. Sarah told the detective that she watched Claire unfold the note. The color instantly drained from Claire's face. She looked absolutely terrified. Claire crumpled the note in her shaking hand, threw it into a small brass trash can sitting next to the front doors, and walked immediately outside into the freezing, pitch-black parking lot. Hayes felt a massive, frantic surge of adrenaline. The note was the absolute key to the entire mystery. He asked Sarah where the paper was. The young maid wept even harder, her voice cracking with profound, paralyzing guilt. She explained that just 5 minutes after Claire walked outside, Sarah had tied up the trash bag and carried it down to the hotel's basement. She had thrown the bag directly into the massive industrial incinerator, completely burning everything inside to ash. When the police locked down the hotel 30 minutes later, Sarah realized with sheer horror that she had accidentally destroyed the most important piece of evidence in the case. She had kept completely quiet for 6 months because she was terrified of being arrested for destroying evidence and desperately feared losing her minimum-wage job. The revelation hit Detective Hayes like a physical blow to the chest. The stranger had handed Claire a threat or a deeply coercive instruction that terrified her enough to walk outside into the dark. But the only physical link to his identity and the only explanation of his leverage had been completely, permanently reduced to ash. Despite having the sketch of the scarred man, the investigation rapidly hit a massive, unyielding brick wall. The police circulated the drawing across the entire state of Tennessee, but absolutely no one recognized the face. He was a phantom. Investigators pored over Claire and Ryan's financial records, searching for massive, hidden debts or strange withdrawals. They found absolutely nothing. They subpoenaed phone records, dragged the deep mountain lakes for a third time, and interviewed every known associate of the couple. But as the bitter winter snows began to melt into the spring of the year 2000, the leads completely dried up. The state police officially reassigned their resources to active cases. The massive incident board in the sheriff's department was slowly taken down, the photographs placed into heavy manila folders, and locked inside a metal filing cabinet. The disappearance of Claire Bennett was officially classified as a cold case. The emotional toll on Ryan Bennett was absolute, crushing devastation. He was eventually forced to pack up his wife's remaining clothes from the lodge and drive back down the mountain completely alone. He returned to his quiet house, walking into the empty rooms that were supposed to be filled with laughter and a long, beautiful future. But Ryan absolutely refused to move on. He refused to hold a memorial service, and he completely refused to believe that his wife was dead. He returned to his job as a high school history teacher, living a quiet, incredibly lonely life. He did not date. He did not remove his silver wedding band. And every single year, on the exact anniversary of their wedding day in August, Ryan sat down at his small wooden kitchen table. He took out a piece of clean, white paper, and he wrote Claire a deeply emotional, heartbreaking letter. He wrote about his teaching job. He wrote about the flowers blooming in their front yard, and he wrote about how much he desperately missed her smile. He folded the letters perfectly, placed them inside a small, wooden shoebox in his closet, and faithfully waited for the day he could finally hand them to her. Years slowly turned into a decade. The world rapidly changed, transitioning into a modern era of high-speed internet and smartphones, but the mystery in the mountains remained completely, agonizingly silent. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning in the autumn of 2010, more than 11 years after Claire vanished, the telephone sitting on Detective Kendrick Hayes's desk suddenly rang. Hayes was now a much older man, his hair heavily grayed, but he had never let the ghost of the honeymoon disappearance fade from his mind. The call was from a local police department in a neighboring county, nearly 2 hours away. A commercial landlord was currently in the process of evicting an abandoned, basement-level storage unit. The unit had been rented under a false name, but the rent payments had completely stopped years ago. When the landlord finally cut the heavy steel padlock and opened the rolling metal door, he found something so deeply disturbing he immediately called the authorities. The local police ran the contents of the unit and traced a massive, terrifying connection directly back to Detective Hayes. Hayes grabbed his coat and drove aggressively across the county, pulling up to the dreary, concrete storage facility. He ducked under the yellow police tape and walked into the dimly lit, freezing storage unit. The small, concrete room was not filled with old furniture or forgotten clothing. It was a massive, highly organized, completely terrifying shrine dedicated entirely to Claire. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Pinned to the concrete walls were hundreds of secret, high-resolution photographs of Claire. But these were not public pictures. They had been taken with a long, expensive telephoto lens. There were pictures of Claire walking to her car in the rain, pictures of her buying groceries, and horrifyingly, pictures taken through the window of her own living room while she was sitting on the couch with Ryan. The photographs proved that Dylan Cross had never accepted the breakup. He had been quietly, obsessively stalking her every single move for months leading up to the wedding. But as Detective Hayes opened a large, heavy plastic storage trunk sitting in the center of the concrete floor, the terrifying reality of the crime completely escalated from a simple obsession into a flawless, deeply calculated military-style operation. Inside the heavy trunk, investigators found a massive collection of careful planning materials. There were detailed topographical maps of the Great Smoky Mountains. There were dozens of fake license plates wrapped in burlap. There was expensive, heavy-duty camping equipment, industrial zip ties, and a box of untraceable prepaid cellular phones. And sitting at the very bottom of the trunk was a large, heavy manila folder. Hayes opened the folder. His hands began to shake violently. Inside were handwritten schedules perfectly, flawlessly matching the exact itinerary of Ryan and Claire's honeymoon trip. Dylan knew exactly what hotel they were staying at. He knew what hiking trails they were planning to take. But the most devastating piece of evidence was a stolen, heavily wrinkled architectural blueprint of the mountain lodge. Hayes spread the blueprint across the trunk. Drawn perfectly in thick red marker was a clear, calculated path leading from the dark woods directly to the exterior wall behind the lodge kitchen. Drawn in the exact center of a heavy red circle was the main electrical breaker box. Dylan had literally written the instructions for the 90-second blackout directly onto the blueprint. The discovery was a massive, completely undeniable breakthrough. Dylan Cross was absolutely the mastermind behind the entire abduction. He had designed the perfect crime, locating the lodge, identifying the security cameras, and planning the exact method to plunge the parking lot into total darkness. But as Detective Hayes stared at the red marker on the blueprint, a massive, impossible paradox completely paralyzed his mind. Dylan had planned it. But on the exact night the plan was executed, Dylan was pouring concrete 400 miles away on a commercial worksite, surrounded by dozens of witnesses and recorded on video. Hayes reached back into the plastic trunk and pulled out a small stack of faded, yellowed gas station receipts and a state highway toll booth ticket. He looked at the printed timestamps on the receipts. The fuel had been purchased in Nashville, Tennessee. The time printed on the receipt was 8:30 in the evening on the night Claire vanished. It was absolutely, physically impossible for the man who planned the crime to have been the man standing in the dark behind the lodge. The horrifying, terrifying truth finally snapped into perfect clarity. Dylan Cross had designed the ultimate, flawless abduction, but he hadn't pulled the electrical switch himself. Dylan had used a proxy. He had hired the older, bald man with the facial scar to execute the kidnapping, perfectly insulating himself with a rock-solid, unbreakable alibi. Dylan was walking free because he had convinced someone else to take his wife in the dark. The massive, impossible paradox sitting at the bottom of the plastic storage trunk completely revolutionized the entire missing person investigation. Detective Kendrick Hayes stood in the freezing, concrete storage unit, staring at the perfectly forged blueprint and the stamped Nashville fuel receipts. Dylan Cross had designed the absolute perfect abduction, but he had flawlessly insulated himself from the physical execution of the crime. He had manipulated someone else into pulling the electrical breaker switch in the dark. Hayes immediately bagged the prepaid cellular phones found in the storage trunk and rushed them to the State Police Digital Forensics Laboratory. Because the phones had been sitting in a damp basement for over 10 years, the internal batteries were completely corroded. However, a highly specialized data technician carefully extracted the fragile internal memory chips and successfully recovered the call logs from August of 1999. The digital history revealed a massive, terrifying pattern. In the days leading up to the honeymoon trip, Dylan Cross had placed dozens of highly secretive phone calls to a single, unregistered telephone number. Investigators traced the number directly to a man named Harrison Miller. When Hayes pulled Harrison Miller's driver's license photograph, a massive, electric jolt of adrenaline shot completely through the entire investigative team. Harrison was an older, heavily built, completely bald man with a thick, distinct surgical scar running directly across his chin, the result of a severe childhood car accident. He was the exact man the young gas station clerk had seen aggressively arguing with Claire. Hayes dug deeply into Harrison's background. He discovered that Harrison was not a hardened, violent criminal. He was a quiet, deeply trusting, easily manipulated man who had been a loyal friend to Dylan Cross for many years. The horrifying psychological brilliance of Dylan's plan suddenly snapped perfectly into place. Dylan had not hired a professional hitman. He had completely, ruthlessly manipulated an old friend who had absolutely no idea he was participating in a violent kidnapping. Detectives realized exactly what Dylan had done. He had approached Harrison playing the role of a desperate, terrified victim. Dylan had lied, claiming he was in massive, dangerous debt to violent loan sharks who were threatening his life. Dylan told Harrison that his girlfriend, Claire, was waiting for him at a mountain lodge, and she needed a highly discreet, secret ride down the mountain in an untraceable dark car to avoid the dangerous debt collectors. Dylan had paid Harrison a large sum of cash to confront Claire at the gas station and hand her a specific, folded note in the hotel lobby later that night. The note had likely contained a terrifying, completely fabricated threat, warning Claire that if she did not step outside into the dark and get into Harrison's vehicle, Dylan would immediately walk into the lodge and severely hurt her new husband. Harrison believed he was simply helping his best friend escape dangerous loan sharks. He pulled the breaker switch exactly as Dylan had instructed, watched Claire walk out into the dark, and quietly drove her away from the mountain, entirely unaware that he was sealing her inside a permanent, living nightmare. Detective Hayes finally had the missing physical link. He assembled a massive, heavily armed tactical team and drove aggressively toward Harrison Miller's last known address, a small, isolated farmhouse located near the state border. The heavily armed deputies surrounded the quiet property. Hayes stood on the front porch, his heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his chest. He was finally, absolutely ready to kick the door open, arrest the accomplice, and demand to know exactly where Harrison had dropped Claire off on that freezing night. But as the officers approached the front door, the heavy, agonizing reality of the cold case delivered its most devastating, completely unfair blow. The front door of the farmhouse was already open. Standing in the living room were two local county paramedics and a medical examiner. Harrison Miller was lying peacefully on his living room sofa, completely still. The medical examiner looked up at Detective Hayes and shook his head. Harrison Miller had suffered a massive, completely unexpected heart attack while watching television. He had died entirely of natural causes just 48 hours before the police finally identified his phone records. Detective Hayes completely collapsed against the wooden doorframe of the farmhouse, utterly destroyed. The only man in the entire world who actually knew the physical location where Claire had been taken was completely dead. The terrifying secret of the mountain lodge died with him forever, taking the only map to Claire directly to the grave. With the death of the unknowing accomplice, the investigation instantly, violently ground to a complete halt. There were absolutely no more leads, no more storage units, and no more phone records. The trail went completely, permanently freezing cold. The heavy, suffocating weight of time slowly began to bury the tragedy. The years rapidly passed, moving completely away from the 1990s. The world entirely changed, transitioning into a modern era of high-speed digital internet and widespread social media. 17 long, agonizing years passed. The year was now 2016. Ryan Bennett was now 44 years old. The youthful, happy high school teacher who had driven his beautiful wife up the winding mountain road was entirely gone. His dark hair was heavily salted with gray, and his eyes carried the permanent, heavy exhaustion of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades walking through the world completely alone. Most people in his life believed Claire was no longer alive. His friends had stopped asking about her, and his family quietly encouraged him to move on. But Ryan absolutely, stubbornly refused. Every single year on their wedding anniversary, Ryan sat at his small kitchen table, exactly as he always had. He wrote Claire a beautiful, heartbreaking letter, telling her about his students, his quiet life, and his absolute, unwavering refusal to stop waiting for her. He folded the letters perfectly and placed them into the large wooden shoebox in his closet. He had 17 letters sitting in the dark, representing 17 years of stolen time. Then, on an ordinary Saturday afternoon in the autumn of 2016, a completely accidental, deeply miraculous event changed the entire course of history. Ryan was visiting his younger sister's house for a quiet family dinner. His teenage nephew was sitting on the living room sofa, watching a popular, live-streamed video on his modern laptop. The video was a viral travel vlog, highlighting a massive, crowded apple festival in a deeply rural, highly isolated farming town in Kentucky. Ryan was walking through the living room, holding a cup of hot coffee, when he casually glanced down at the glowing laptop screen. The vlogger was talking loudly into the camera, showing off the large wooden stalls filled with fresh apples. But for exactly 4 seconds, an older woman holding a small woven basket walked directly behind the vlogger in the background of the shot. Ryan completely froze. The heavy ceramic coffee mug slipped directly from his trembling fingers, shattering violently against the hardwood floor, sending hot coffee splashing across his shoes. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He lunged forward, grabbing the laptop directly out of his nephew's hands. His nephew yelled in protest, but Ryan ignored him completely. He frantically paused the live video and used the cursor to carefully rewind the footage exactly 10 seconds. He paused the screen exactly when the older woman walked into the frame. He zoomed the digital image in as far as the pixels would allow. The woman was wearing a faded denim jacket, her hair pulled back into a messy, graying ponytail. She looked incredibly pale, exhausted, and deeply weathered by a hard life. But sitting perfectly, exactly just below her left ear, completely unchanged by 17 years of absolute silence, was a tiny, distinct birthmark. "Claire," Ryan choked out, his voice cracking into a raw, desperate, agonizing sob that silenced the entire living room. Ryan didn't wait. He immediately pulled his cellular phone from his pocket and dialed the personal number of Kendrick Hayes. Hayes was now deeply retired, an old man completely detached from the police force, but he had never thrown his old case files away. When Ryan hysterically explained the viral video to the old detective, Hayes told him to get into his car immediately. They met on the highway and drove aggressively across state lines, speeding directly toward the rural, deeply isolated farmlands of Kentucky. They contacted the local Kentucky authorities on their drive, sending the screenshot of the viral video to the rural sheriff's department. The local deputies recognized the older woman immediately. They explained that she lived quietly with an elderly, reclusive farming family on a massive, highly isolated agricultural property just a few miles outside of town. The local police warned Hayes that the woman was incredibly timid. The farming family claimed they had taken her in nearly 15 years ago when she was completely homeless and suffering from severe, profound amnesia. She had absolutely no driver's license, no verifiable birth certificate, and she rarely ever left the town limits alone. The locals simply knew her as Anna. When Ryan and Hayes finally arrived at the sprawling, isolated farm, the autumn sun was just beginning to set behind the Kentucky hills. They parked their vehicle near a large, weathered red barn. A woman walked slowly out of the barn, holding a heavy metal bucket of animal feed. Ryan stepped out of the vehicle. His heart was hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribcage. He walked slowly across the gravel driveway, entirely unable to take his eyes off her face. It was absolutely, undeniably Claire. She was 17 years older, her face lined with a profound, heavy sadness, but the beautiful green eyes and the tiny birthmark were exactly the same. The massive, impossible miracle was standing directly in front of him. "Claire," Ryan whispered, the heavy tears openly flooding down his cheeks. He took a desperate step forward, raising his trembling hands. "Claire, it's me. It's Ryan. I finally found you." The woman stopped walking. She gripped the heavy metal bucket tightly, looking at the crying, emotional man standing in her driveway. But her reaction completely shattered Ryan's entire soul into a million pieces. She did not smile. She did not run to him. Her large green eyes were completely blank, filled with a deep, paralyzing, absolute terror. She took a massive, frantic step backward, shielding herself with the heavy metal bucket. "I don't know who you are," the woman stammered, her voice shaking violently. "My name is Anna. You have the wrong person. Please, you need to leave right now. I have absolutely never been to Tennessee. I don't know you." The absolute, devastating rejection hit Ryan like a massive physical blow to the chest. He stopped walking, completely paralyzed by the sheer horror of her words. The woman he had loved and waited for every single day for 17 years was looking at him exactly as if he were a completely dangerous, terrifying stranger. Detective Hayes stepped forward, raising his hands gently, trying to calm the situation down. He thought perhaps the 15-year-old story of amnesia was actually true. If she had suffered a severe, traumatic brain injury during the kidnapping, her memory of Ryan and her entire past life might be completely, permanently erased. Hayes was ready to slowly step back, call the local authorities, and arrange for an official, gentle DNA test. He turned to Ryan, quietly suggesting they give her some space so they didn't completely terrify her. But Ryan completely ignored the detective. He didn't move. He stood perfectly still in the gravel driveway, his eyes locked entirely on the woman's trembling hands. Anna was terrified. She was looking frantically around the farm, desperately hoping the elderly owners would come out of the house. And as she stood there, entirely consumed by panic, she reached her right hand over to her left hand. She began to violently, rapidly, and nervously twist a plain silver ring around her left ring finger. It was the exact, highly specific, entirely unique physical coping mechanism Claire had always used whenever she was feeling incredibly anxious or overwhelmed. It was a deeply ingrained, subconscious habit that a person simply could not fake, and a habit she could absolutely never forget, even with profound amnesia. The physical movement completely destroyed the lie. She was not a stranger with amnesia. She was not Anna, she was Claire Bennett. But as Ryan looked at her violently twisting the ring, staring into her absolutely terrified, completely broken green eyes. A massive, horrifying realization washed completely over him. She was lying. She knew exactly who he was. She remembered Tennessee. But her mind had been completely, systematically dismantled. She was not suffering from amnesia. She was trapped inside a massive, invisible psychological prison built entirely on absolute fear. And as Detective Hayes looked past Claire, staring through the open wooden doors of the weathered red barn, he saw a dusty, faded photograph pinned to a corkboard on the wall. It was a picture of the elderly farming family, standing proudly in their fields years ago. And standing directly behind them, smiling warmly with his arm wrapped securely around the old farmer's shoulder, was Dylan Cross. The sight of Dylan Cross smiling warmly in the faded photograph pinned to the barn wall completely broke the entire mystery wide open. Detective Kendrick Hayes stared at the picture, the blood running absolutely cold in his veins. The massive, horrifying reality of the situation instantly shifted from a simple cold case into a deeply twisted, highly organized psychological nightmare. Dylan had not just hired a desperate friend to kidnap Claire and drop her off in the middle of nowhere. He had meticulously orchestrated her completely new life, isolating her in the deep rural farmlands of Kentucky, and had actively embedded himself directly into her new, terrifying reality. Hayes immediately pulled his badge, stepped between Ryan and the trembling woman holding the metal bucket, and took absolute control of the situation. He contacted the local Kentucky authorities, ordering a massive, immediate tactical lockdown of the entire agricultural property. When the local deputies arrived, they quickly and gently separated Claire from the elderly farming family. The farmers, a quiet, deeply religious couple in their late 70s, were completely terrified and utterly confused by the sudden swarm of heavily armed police officers. During their interviews, the absolute innocence of the farmers became heartbreakingly clear. They genuinely believed the woman's name was Anna. They explained that nearly 15 years ago, Dylan Cross had brought her to their farm, claiming she was a distant relative who had suffered a massive brain injury in a terrible car accident. Dylan had told the kind farmers that she had severe memory loss and needed a quiet, safe place to live far away from the loud city. The farmers had taken her in, completely unaware that they were providing a secure, isolated prison for a kidnapped bride. When Hayes demanded to know exactly where Dylan Cross was currently living, the old farmer simply shook his head. He explained that Dylan used to visit the farm every single week for years, acting like a caring friend checking in on his injured relative. But nearly 2 years ago, Dylan had suddenly, quietly packed up all of his belongings and completely vanished. He had sold his old truck, changed his phone number, and assumed an entirely new identity, leaving the farm and Claire entirely behind. The investigative team immediately focused their attention on a small, deeply weathered wooden cabin sitting at the absolute farthest edge of the massive farming property. It was the cabin where Dylan had stayed during his frequent visits. Hayes and the local deputies walked across the overgrown fields and kicked the heavy wooden door of the cabin open. The interior was completely covered in thick layers of dust and cobwebs. It looked exactly like a room that had been abandoned for 2 years. But as they systematically searched the small space, pulling up loose floorboards and checking behind the heavy wooden dressers, they uncovered the true, horrifying depth of Dylan's obsession. Hidden inside a hollowed-out section of the bedroom wall, detectives found a massive stack of thick, leather-bound journals. Hayes opened the first journal, gently turning the dusty pages. The handwriting belonged entirely to Dylan Cross. The journals contained 17 years of meticulous, terrifying documentation. Dylan had recorded Claire's daily routines, her massive fears, her early, desperate attempts to escape, and her slowly deteriorating emotional state. But the most horrifying revelation hidden within the pages was the exact method Dylan had used to keep her on the farm. His control over her life was chillingly methodical. The journals revealed that Dylan rarely used physical force after the first few terrible years. He didn't need heavy chains, and he didn't need locked doors. Instead, he had completely dismantled her mind. Dylan had spent years feeding Claire carefully constructed, completely devastating lies. He had brought her heavily forged, fake newspaper clippings, claiming the police had officially stopped looking for her. He told her that Ryan had quickly moved on, completely forgetting about her, and had married another woman just 2 years after the honeymoon. He convinced her that her own parents believed she had willingly run away and that absolutely no one in Tennessee wanted her back. Slowly, methodically, he had replaced her hope with absolute despair. The massive weight of the lies had crushed her spirit, completely trapping her inside a suffocating psychological prison. She had eventually stopped trying to run because Dylan had successfully convinced her that there was absolutely nowhere left in the world to run to. She stayed on the farm because it was the only place on earth where she believed she belonged. But as the police expanded their search into the main farmhouse, they discovered that Dylan's absolute control over her mind had never been completely successful. Detectives gently asked the elderly farmers for permission to search the small, quiet bedroom where Claire had lived for the past 15 years. While carefully examining the room, a young deputy noticed a small, uneven gap in the wooden floorboards directly beneath the heavy wooden bed frame. The deputy pulled the loose floorboard up, shining his flashlight into the dark, dusty space between the wooden beams. Resting quietly in the dark was a small, heavily worn, spiral-bound notebook. Hayes carefully lifted the notebook from the floorboards and opened it. The handwriting inside was shaky, fragile, and completely beautiful. It was Claire's handwriting. While Dylan had been documenting his twisted control, Claire had been secretly documenting her absolute, unbroken survival. Every single year, completely hidden from Dylan and the farmers, Claire had secretly written down her true memories. She wrote about the beautiful honeymoon lodge in the mountains. She wrote about the exact way Ryan smiled when he looked at her. And she wrote, over and over again, that she completely refused to forget her true name. The hidden notebook proved that despite the terrifying psychological conditioning, despite the forged newspaper clippings, and despite 17 years of isolation, she had never stopped loving her husband, and she had never, ever stopped dreaming of a way to finally escape. But nestled directly behind the hidden notebook, the detectives found something that completely shattered the hearts of everyone in the room. It was a small, tied bundle of envelopes. They were letters Claire had desperately tried to mail over the years. She had secretly written to Ryan, begging him for help, trying to tell him exactly where she was hidden. She had snuck out to the rural mailbox at the end of the long dirt driveway and placed them inside, hoping the postal worker would take them away. But Dylan had been watching. The journals revealed that Dylan had secretly intercepted every single one of those letters before the mail carrier ever arrived. He had stolen her desperate cries for help, keeping the unmailed letters hidden in the cabin, ensuring that Ryan and Claire would continue to believe the other had completely forgotten them. The tragedy of the intercepted mail was absolutely devastating. For 17 years, Ryan had been writing letters and putting them in a shoebox, entirely unable to send them. And for 17 years, Claire had been writing letters and putting them in a mailbox, entirely unable to reach him. They had been reaching out for each other in the dark for nearly 2 decades, separated only by the cruel, deeply manipulative lies of one man. With the massive mountain of evidence recovered from the farm, the final, official step of the investigation was initiated. Claire was gently transported to a secure, comfortable medical facility in the local town. The authorities treated her with profound kindness and absolute patience. They performed an advanced, highly accurate DNA test to officially establish her identity for the legal record. Just a few days later, the laboratory results were officially returned. The genetic markers confirmed, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the woman known as Anna was completely, undeniably Claire Bennett. Detective Hayes walked into the quiet medical room where Claire was sitting. He pulled up a chair, looked her directly in the eyes, and slowly, gently explained the absolute truth. He showed her the official DNA paperwork. He explained the terrifying deception Dylan had orchestrated. And most importantly, he told her that Ryan had absolutely never remarried, that he had never stopped looking for her, and that he had spent the last 17 years loving her with every single ounce of his heart. As the truth finally washed over her, the massive, invisible psychological walls Dylan had built completely crumbled into a million pieces. The absolute terror in her green eyes was instantly replaced by a sudden, breathtaking clarity. The heavy weight of 15 years of lies completely lifted off her shoulders. She covered her face with her hands, weeping with a raw, agonizing, completely overwhelming mixture of profound grief and absolute, undeniable relief. The woman who had spent 17 years believing she had lost absolutely everything was finally given back her true identity. The very next morning, the incredible, impossible reunion finally took place. It did not happen in a crowded room, and there were no flashing cameras or dramatic, Hollywood-style speeches. It happened in a quiet, sunlit room at the local police station. Ryan walked slowly through the heavy wooden door. He was holding a large, heavy wooden shoebox tightly against his chest. Claire was sitting on a small sofa near the window. When the door opened, she slowly stood up. She looked at the man she had married in the summer of 1999. His dark hair was now gray, and the years had heavily lined his face, but his eyes were exactly the same. They were filled with the absolute, unconditional safety she had desperately missed every single day. They did not rush toward each other with loud, dramatic cries. The sheer magnitude of the moment was too profound, too heavily weighted with the unimaginable tragedy of stolen time. Ryan walked slowly across the quiet room. He stopped just a few feet away from her. Without saying a single word, his hands trembling violently, he slowly opened the wooden shoebox. He reached inside and gently handed her the first perfectly folded, handwritten anniversary letter. And then he handed her the next one, and the next. Claire looked down at the 17 letters. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the heavily worn, spiral-bound notebook she had hidden under the floorboards, and gently placed it directly into Ryan's hands. They stood together in the quiet sunlight, looking at the undeniable physical proof of their enduring love. Neither of them had ever stopped waiting for the other. Neither of them had ever truly let go. Ryan reached forward, gently wrapping his arms around her fragile shoulders, pulling her securely against his chest. Claire buried her face into his neck, holding onto him with a fierce, desperate strength. They wept quietly, holding each other as the 17 years of agonizing, forced separation entirely melted away in the warmth of that beautiful, completely unbreakable embrace. In the months following the miraculous discovery, the full weight of the American justice system came crashing down on Dylan Cross. Using the advanced financial records and digital clues found inside the abandoned Kentucky cabin, a highly specialized federal task force tracked Dylan's new, assumed identity. They finally located him living quietly in a massive suburban neighborhood in Ohio, working under a completely fake name at a local hardware store. The authorities did not give him a chance to run. A massive team of federal marshals surrounded his home in the early hours of the morning, kicking the heavy front door entirely off its hinges. Dylan was dragged out of the house in heavy steel handcuffs, completely shocked that his flawless, 17-year-old deception had finally collapsed. During the highly publicized criminal trial, Dylan's legal defense was completely obliterated. The prosecutors presented the stolen architectural blueprint of the lodge, the prepaid phone records linking him directly to the late Harrison Miller, and the massive stack of horrifying, handwritten journals detailing his psychological torture of Claire. Faced with an overwhelming, completely undeniable mountain of physical and digital evidence, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Dylan Cross was convicted on multiple federal charges, including aggravated kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and severe psychological abuse. The judge showed absolutely no mercy, handing down a massive sentence that guaranteed the man who had spent his life locking others in the dark would die entirely alone in a small, concrete prison cell. The long, difficult road to recovery for Ryan and Claire was not easy. Healing from nearly 2 decades of profound, massive trauma requires incredible patience, deep psychological therapy, and an absolute commitment to trust. They moved back to their quiet home in Tennessee, slowly rebuilding their life together one day at a time. Ryan retired from his teaching job to spend every single moment with his wife, helping her navigate the massive changes the modern world had undergone while she was locked away. But they did not let the trauma define the rest of their lives. Nearly a year after the rescue, on a crisp, beautiful autumn morning, Ryan and Claire packed a small suitcase and got into their car. They drove slowly up the winding, steep mountain roads of eastern Tennessee. They drove completely past the small rural gas station, driving directly toward the deep, towering pine forests of the Great Smoky Mountains. They pulled into the gravel parking lot of the exact same timber lodge where their nightmare had begun. They walked slowly across the gravel, standing directly in front of the small wooden bench sitting perfectly under the flickering yellow street lamp. They stood together in the crisp mountain air, holding hands tightly. They had intentionally chosen to return to the absolute hardest place on earth. They refused to let Dylan Cross permanently steal the memory of their honeymoon. They chose not to remember the lodge as the terrible place where their beautiful lives were violently stolen in the dark. Instead, as Ryan looked down at Claire, and Claire smiled beautifully back at him, they chose to remember it as the place where the truth had finally, miraculously found its way home. The story of the newly married woman who vanished during a 90-second blackout stands as a chilling, deeply terrifying reminder of how easily a life can be manipulated by obsession and lies. It proves that the most dangerous monsters do not always use heavy chains. Sometimes they use fear, isolation, and stolen letters to build invisible walls. But far more importantly, it remains an immortal, unbreakable testament to the absolute power of true love and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. A predator can cut the power, he can steal a life, and he can completely isolate a person from the entire world for 17 long, agonizing years. He can believe he has permanently silenced the truth in the dark. But true love is a remarkably patient, indestructible force. It waits quietly in the small, unmailed letters hidden in a closet. It survives in a dusty notebook buried deep beneath the floorboards. It perseveres through the deepest isolation and the cruelest lies. Time has a way of eventually shattering even the most flawless deceptions, proving that no matter how many years pass, and no matter how dark the night becomes, hope will always find a way to cut through the static, completely destroying the silence, and finally guiding the lost ones home.